Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and it's a real, it's very touching to hear someone who's read my work talk about it, and so I appreciate that so much. It's lovely to be here this evening. Beautiful, beautiful place, and I'm so happy to have been invited. Oh my God, and James is here, my former, oh my God, Chris is also here, published author now. 2 of my former students are here. This is like a huge treat. I'm just going to read a little bit from my new book. And as David was saying, it's nothing like the book that those of you who've been reading Hunger have read. And it's nothing like my second novel either, being rather slim. And I thought it would be sort of fun to read it because it's different. So I'm just going to read a long scene that starts on page 37 of the book. And there are a few things that I'm going to tell you about that you should know about this book. Basically, I'm only reading from the beginning. It starts in a writing program, a graduate writing program, where they have these classes called workshops. And I don't know if any of you have ever taken a class like, you're nodding, okay. So you put your story in, everyone in the class reads your story, and then they talk about it and sort of about you, even though that's not supposed to be what they're doing. Well, you sit in the room and you're not allowed to speak. Sort of like torture. And our hero in the story is named Roman, and his ambition in life is to be a great poet, and it's what he wants. He's basically privileging this ambition over anything else, including having sort of like compassionate personal relationships with other people, because he's so ambitious, and it's just a stage he's going through. But I wanted to read a section from his life at graduate school. You should also know that Miranda is the teacher, and she can be really mean, and they never know what she's going to do or say. And that Bernard is Roman's best friend, and he's this really sweet, sweet kind of nerdy guy who is sweet and nerdy guy, very, very serious. And that Lucy is the pretty girl. Okay, no one laughs, but it turns out that's sort of her role for a while in this book. Roman submitted 3 of his new poems for critique at the final class. They were very good, he believed, far beyond what he had ever done. Powerful jigsaw pieces of an intimate world. Who the man and woman were, he could not guess. They had simply spoken, and he had not censored their words, passionate or estranged. He had worked long hours at these poems, worked harder than he ever had, and although in truth he did not know exactly what he had written, he found the poems powerful and mysterious in a way that puzzled him and drew him to his desk as nothing had before. It was mid-December, the afternoon before the holiday party. The seminar room darkened quickly, the twilight thickening with the steady fall of freezing rain changing to snow. Miranda wandered into class 10 minutes late. She wore a fringed black skirt much shorter than the fashions of the time, black high-heeled boots, and dark green stockings that had the queer, brushed look of suede. Roman watched her legs go by his end of the table and suppressed an impulse to lay his hand against those stockings. He looked away. Someone had passed around a box of candles. The students leaned forward with matches and lighters. From several chairs over, Bernard offered him a paper cup of wine. He accepted it and moved slightly back from the table so nobody would see his shaking hands. He was angry that this critique would matter so much to him. Miranda went through several student poems at a brisk pace. Lucy Perry had put up an interesting sonnet, and Shannon Bruno had submitted, to Roman's grudging admiration, another fragmented collage. This time it seemed to be about the fearsomeness of lions. This they discussed without a peep from Miranda. No more lectures on the speciousness of poems based on literary theory. Roman finished his cup of wine and poured himself another. After a short break, halfway through the period, Miranda turned to his work and asked him to read. Roman began. His voice was loud in his ears, and it seemed to interrupt some atmosphere that had been created in the discussion. He lowered his volume and spoke carefully, keeping his tone flat so as not to reveal his nerves. Read aloud to an audience, the poems seemed intimate, almost too intimate. It occurred to him that the class might think he was describing his own experience. When he had finished, there followed a long pause. Roman glanced surreptitiously around the room, but it was impossible to tell what his classmates were thinking. He wondered if he should clear his throat to get the conversation going, but decided it might be seen as a display of emotion. Slowly, trying not to catch anyone's gaze, he took out his notebook. "Well," somebody said, "these are certainly poems that insist upon being heard." There was another long pause after that. During this time, Roman wrote in his notebook, "Poems insist on being heard." It was one of his strategies to take notes on everything. He had developed this activity as an undergraduate. It kept him properly employed during the stress of critiques. "The use of certain words," someone began and stopped. Roman wrote, "Certain words." There were some crude sexual words in the text. There followed a somewhat halting conversation in which the use of slang words in a formal poem was dissected. The use of those particular words to describe those particular actions was critiqued. Roman stole a glance at Phoebe Platts. Oh, I should say that he dated Phoebe and dumped her, so she's not happy with him. Phoebe wore a low-cut green sweater. She sat with her arms folded and her lips pursed. She had chosen the exact middle of the long table, and from his usual spot at the end, Roman observed her frustration with the discussion so far. He was watching for a certain expression he had seen many times during their brief relationship, a smug, preening look, when she felt that any event or person reinforced her own opinions or experiences. He knew now, by the absence of this look, that the discussion was not yet punishing enough. As if she, too, had noticed Phoebe, Marlene, one of the other acolytes, cleared her throat. Marlene was a tall, wealthy girl from California with a large nose and a collection of Bakelite bracelets she wore on her long, thin wrists. "It's my opinion that the use of certain words evinces a want of character," she said. Roman wrote down "evinces" and weighted his pen over the page. Surely someone would point out the pointlessness, the utter stupidity of this remark, but no one did. Then Phoebe lifted her face into the candlelight and spoke. She said in a loud voice, "I found the use of sex in the poems to be aggressive." Roman wrote, "Sex aggressive." Marlene's bracelets clicked together. She asked Phoebe, what did she mean? "I mean that the work itself is violent and aggressive toward the reader," Phoebe said. Roman wrote, "Toward reader." After a brief pause, Marlene asked, "Do you mean sexual aggression?" "As a reader," Phoebe said, "I felt that I was being violated." Roman began, "Phoebe feels," and stopped. He would not take notes on this. To his dismay, no one contradicted her. Instead, they spoke for almost 20 minutes about the various sexual acts alluded to, the language in which they were alluded to, and the passages which were most like violation. Roman glanced at the other men in the class. Bob Lou, to his left, was doodling on the manuscript, and Charlie Kruger's face was hidden. Roman looked at Bernard. Even in the candlelight, he could see Bernard blushing. Bernard would be of no help here. Roman strained to see Miranda. Miranda's curly hair was escaping its knot. She sat very straight, raising her face high above the candles. She wore the faintest smile on her lips. Mimi Wong, a friend of Phoebe's and Marlene's, asked, "If a sexual act is alluded to in such crude terms, would one not, as the writer, be subjecting the reader to a form of violence? That is, although not physically violent, a form of rape?" "Form of rape," said Marlene. "Rape is rape. The use of words for the purpose of sexual violence is simply more insidious." "And yet equally invidious," Mimi agreed. There followed a pause. Phoebe did not say another word, but there appeared a trace of the preening expression that Roman remembered. It was intolerable. Roman focused all of his strength on seeming indifferent. As he held himself as motionless as possible, a twinge of pain deepened and moved down his shoulder blades into his lower back. Then, from somewhere on the other side of the table, a woman spoke. "I feel compelled to point out," she began, Roman could not identify the voice because she spoke so cruelly and precisely, as if she too found the scene intolerable. "Although the work might be offensive to some," she began again, "I feel that in focusing on the sexual content of the poems, we are missing some rewarding avenues of discussion." Roman squinted into the gloom. It was Lucy Perry, looking earnest and particularly pretty. "Specifically," Lucy said, "I'd like to talk about the lineation. The opening of the second poem, before the dialogue begins, employs line breaks to create a very different tone from the body of the poem. I found myself wondering at this break in tone and was interested to know if anyone else would have any thoughts on it." No one spoke. After a moment, Lucy continued. Roman was overwhelmed with gratitude. Lucy was the youngest poet in the program, barely 21. But she had made a serious study of technique. As she spoke, Roman had the opportunity to admire her for her clarity, her intelligence, and her seriousness. Lucy's remarks were followed by a respectful silence. Then Marlene began the conversation again. Exactly what might constitute the rape of a reader? Was it an abuse of artistic power for the poet to rape the reader? "What do you think?" someone finally asked Miranda, and 11 faces turned toward Miranda's end of the table. She sat with lowered gaze. Roman could not tell if she had heard. Then, like a mermaid perched upon a rock, she brought both hands to her hair and slowly knotted it behind her. She raised her face into the light, features perfectly balanced, inscrutable. "In most love poems," she said, "there is some clarity on the question, who is speaking? Is he or she the one who desires, or the object of desire? In these poems, I find very little desire to speak of." Was she looking at Roman? She was not. He hated her. He felt with certainty that her aloofness was meant particularly for him. She had ignored him all semester, and it could not be entirely his fault. She continued, still not looking at him. "Who would one rather be? The one who desires, or the object of desire? One's answer to this question might determine if he is meant to be a poet or something else entirely." "Who wouldn't want to be the object of desire?" asked Phoebe. "If unequal affections must there be, let the more loving one be me," quoted Bernard, looking ahead as if the line had come to him in a dream. "Meant to be what?" someone asked. "If not a poet, then what is one meant to be?" "A senator," Miranda said. "A military officer. A playboy." Her gaze flickered in Roman's direction. "No one in the world is thanking you for being a poet." Then she shrugged. There was a world of dismissiveness in her shrug. She peered at her watch. "Time's up." She buried herself in a leather-bound appointment book. One elegant hand emerged and gestured toward the door as if to say, "Shoo." They had gone 10 minutes over the period. After a brief silence, the students pushed back their chairs. They fumbled for their overcoats, umbrellas, and cigarettes and ambled out into the freezing rain. Roman stayed in his seat, splintering with anger. He felt compelled to wait until even Bernard had gone. Miranda still sat at the other end of the empty table in the flickering reddish light, looking absently through her appointment book. Roman leaned forward and blew out a candle. Now she seemed to be searching for a pen she had used earlier to secure her knot of hair. Roman blew out another candle. Soon she would be sitting entirely in the dark. She would be forced to look up to acknowledge him, if only to ask him to turn on the light. He threw out the stained paper cups, arranged the extinguished candles in their cardboard tray. When he had worked his way up to her end of the table, he paused before the single remaining light. He cleared his throat. "Yes?" "It's me," he said. "Oh, of course, yes," she said. "It's Roman," he said, and handed her a pen. "Thank you, Roman." Her brief glance was a reluctant one. "Professor Sturgis," he said, "may I ask you a question?" She nodded at her appointment book. "Did you like my poems?" She answered absently, "They're very strong poems." "Did you like them?" Miranda set down her pen. He had noticed in class her tendency to stare ahead when she was thinking. Now she gazed forward, and a chisel line deepened between her eyebrows. "No," she said, and her rich, fluid voice was blunt. "To tell you the truth, I did not like your poems." Go on, he said, shifting his weight. If you want me to be honest, you're quite talented, she said. There's a great deal of power in your work, but there's something hidden in the poems. They draw attention and give nothing back. She turned again to her appointment book. She was still waiting for him to leave the room. When he did not leave, she made the same shooing gesture she had made to the rest of the class. Roman jammed his hands into his pockets. I'm not leaving yet, he said. I thought that you were in some ways just showing off, she said, drawing a line through something in the book. Now will you leave? There's more, he said. In exasperation, she put down the pen and looked right into his face. He found that he could scarcely meet her eyes. She seemed to recognize not only what he was, one of the many ambitious young men who crowded her after readings and at conferences, but who he was, some essence, problematic though it might be, setting him apart from the others. This judgment frightened him, and yet it thrilled him in a way, for there it was again, proof of her capacity for the partiality that he craved. She was about to speak. Despite his best effort, he turned away like a man before a firing squad. You write as if you have no soul, she said. There followed the sound of a quick breath, and it was a moment before he understood that the breath was his. He made himself look at Miranda. She was studying the table, and he felt viscerally now the sudden cast of reluctance, perhaps regret, that shadowed her features. That's not exactly what I meant, she said. He pressed her. What do you mean? It means I don't quite trust your motives for writing poetry. Motives? Certainly it was a worthy question. How many other things could all of them be doing at that moment other than arguing and moaning and dissecting and growing more passionate about an activity that mattered to virtually no one and would likely never earn them a living? But why was she saying this to him, Roman? What did his motives matter to her? Was not the power of the poems themselves all that mattered? Why do you write poetry, he asked. Why does anyone? She said, why do we want to fall in love? Why do we want to pray? She gazed at him, at once pure and alive, but he stood stunned, unable to reply. I mean that these poems are nothing about love, she said. It was not what he expected. I wouldn't know, he blurted. You wouldn't know. It was a question. I've never been in love, he said, suddenly knowing this was true. Miranda bit her lip. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I'm sorry. His words broke through some gossamer strand of mutual reserve. The air between them thickened. It was a feeling almost palpable, and so was the impression of her floating closer while sitting still, shimmering there in the half-dark, as if their very outlines blurred. During the long silence, Roman tried to hold her gaze, but to his vague interest and surprise, she turned away. In the flicker of the candle, her profile was delicate and touched with signs of age, a shadow under the eye, a line curving from the base of her elegant nose to the corner of her mouth. Roman had an unexpected and urgent sense that he was closer at this very moment than he had ever been to knowing her, to identifying the uncanny force that guided her. Although he hadn't drunk much in class, he felt as unbalanced as if he had. He reached his hand toward Miranda's face. Her startled eyes lifted to his, and in his fingertips he felt the throb of his pulse. Roman withdrew his hand. Too much wine, he said, and left the room. In the corridor, he could not help glancing back. She sat with her profile lit by the last candle, absolutely still. Early in adolescence, Roman had discovered that he had the capacity to make women violently upset. A brief, bright period of happiness would lead to expectations, then to tears, blaming, and a long, miserable comet's tail of accusations. He would vow to remain solitary, but eventually succumb to the desire for company only to be scorched by someone else's disappointment. He had many opportunities, but for some reason, perhaps even because of the number of opportunities, the sensation of love had eluded him. Miranda's condolences spoke to a thought that he had begun to entertain with some frequency, namely that despite an ability to attract many women, he was in some way deficient, and that he might be, because of this, deficient as a poet. Phoebe Platts was only the most recent case. She had been named for a Shakespearean character. She was the godchild of one of the faculty emeriti. She smoked clove cigarettes, a few things he had found interesting for 2 weeks of their relationship, before he grew annoyed with the odor of her breath mints and the way she always sat near the front when they attended readings, looking furtively over her shoulder to see if anyone had noticed them together. Roman also wearied of Phoebe's intimate knowledge of the school faculty. Her godfather, John Weatherby, had fallen in love with the student years before. He had been rejected and was now, according to Phoebe, a shadow of himself. Phoebe called Weatherby a saint compared to Thomas Jonquil, an extremely influential radical poet, frequent adjunct to the program, who slept with a different young male student each time he came to visit. These young men, Phoebe said, had all gone on to do quite well. Roman wanted to cover his ears. When he expressed his distaste, Phoebe insisted that professors were intimate with students all the time. "It's not illegal," she said, "and if you erased every professor who had slept with a student or married a former student, the academy would cease to reproduce." And yet it was Phoebe who had introduced him to Miranda's work, lending him a copy of her first book, Flight. Roman had come to school for its institutional reputation. He had in honesty overlooked most of Miranda's work. He was entirely unprepared for Flight. There he discovered all the passion and cruel truth, the fierceness and disdain for the ordinary that he had failed to find in the relationship with Phoebe. Annoyed by his admiration, she picked a quarrel with him for not returning the book. One memorable Sunday night, he ignored her phone calls, then ignored her knocking and shouting from the stairs outside of his apartment, while he sat at his desk inside rereading each poem in the collection. On Monday evening, when they broke up, she made him hand it over. He had wondered then and since what this poet who had written Flight would make of him, of his work, himself. Now he knew. He wanted to get drunk. Instead of going to the holiday party, which was being held at a bar, he bought a bottle of cheap bourbon and sat in his apartment, pouring shots into a coffee mug and rereading his poems. He read them aloud over and over, attempting to make his own voice reassert itself over the absurd cacophony of the evening. He would not be put off the course by the remarks of idiots. He would not question himself. He would not defend his motives for writing poetry. He worked his way down to the label of the bottle and then, thinking it over, put the bourbon away for later. It was 11 o'clock. Roman stood up and found his balance. He changed his shirt, shaved carefully so as not to nick himself, and got into his car. He didn't want to go to the party, but there was nothing else to do. The party was being held in the upstairs room of a ratty local pub. It was not a large room, and nearly all 60 students in the program had already arrived. Roman stood in the doorway, feeling overheated and uncomfortable. The acolytes in their dramatic makeup and revealing holiday dresses seemed to him a gauntlet between him and the bar. He held his ground near the door. There he was joined by Charlie Kruger, who launched into a witticism about Phoebe. Roman awkwardly excused himself, bypassed the acolytes, and ordered a bourbon. He would wait for Bernard. Bernard had mentioned that for this festive occasion he would alter his routine and stay up late enough to attend the party. Roman was looking around, trying to discern if Bernard had already been and gone, or where he might otherwise be, when to his surprise, one of the visiting faculty appeared in the doorway, and following him, Miranda Sturgis. None of the faculty typically attended student parties. Miranda wore a simple black coat with its collar turned up against the cold, avoiding the fashion of many scarves affected by her students. Despite her high heels, she seemed shorter than usual and out of place. He watched her and the visitor, Jonathan Sessions from the Iowa program, enter the room, assess the space, point to a table past the bar near the small dance floor. The buzz generated by their appearance was considerable. Miranda made her way into the far corner, near Roman's end of the bar, and removed her coat. She stood in a scarlet dress, revealing a body more frail, more carefully made than Roman had imagined. He felt again the urgency that had surprised him after class. He turned and bought another bourbon. Someone turned up the music encouragingly, although no one moved out to the floor. Minutes passed and another song began. Holding on to his bourbon, Roman walked over to Miranda. "Would you care to dance?" She squinted up at him as if to identify him in the dim light. "I'm sorry," she said, reaching for her purse. "I have to use the bathroom." Later then, he went back to the bar. She was gone from the room for quite some time. When she returned, she gave the bar a wide berth. Roman finished his drink and ordered another. He was running out of cash, but he was appalled by what he had just done. He hated Miranda, and she hated him. He loved her poetry, and she hated his. He had never before possessed the slightest hint of self-destructiveness and had never desired in the least personal humiliation, and yet he had embarrassed himself with her twice in the space of a few hours. "Hello, Roman," someone said. It was Lucy Perry, looking elegant in a black dress whose plainness Roman knew was really very expensive. "May I get you a drink?" he asked. "Sure," she said. He felt foolish since he now had only a few dollars, but it would never occur to Lucy to pay him back. But when he turned to hand her the wine, she reached into her small black bag, even the bag looked expensive, and took out her wallet. "No," he said, feeling even more foolish. He wanted to give her something. "I owe you at least this much for defending me in class." "Don't mention it," Lucy said. "They might have been offensive poems, but they were very strong poems." She nodded and smiled as she spoke. She was a slender girl with shining chestnut hair, beautifully shaped, full lips, and appealing shadows under her hazel green eyes. He was unable to return her smile. Glancing across the room, he saw Miranda take the dance floor with a male student, a mediocre poet. He refused to watch the dancing and instead stood with Lucy discussing their reading for a literature class. She took her courses seriously. Roman did his best to say something interesting about Elizabeth Bishop, but what he wanted to ask Lucy was, did she think his poems were offensive? In what way? How was it possible to write honestly about sex without offending somebody? But that conversation seemed at once too intense, too self-centered, and too suggestive. Stealing an occasional glimpse, he saw two more students approach Miranda. She danced with each of them. The visiting instructor fended off another student and took his turn. Then, during a break in the music, Bernard appeared. Roman had not seen him enter the room. Dressed in his usual sweater and red tie, he walked up to Miranda and made an awkward little bow. "Roman, look! Bernard is asking Miranda to dance." Lucy, laughing, touched his arm and pointed, forcing Roman to stop pretending that he was not watching them. Bernard stood opposite Miranda, waiting for the next song. "Isn't that sweet?" Roman nodded. Miranda's hair had slipped halfway from its knot. Her eyes were gleaming. "Would you like to dance?" Lucy gestured toward the others. Roman shook his head. "How are you and Max?" he asked. Max Sabor was a fiercely gifted and erratic writer, a recent graduate of the school who had already made some success as a playwright. "We're off at the moment," Lucy said. A dancer touched the flashing strobe. A speck of light flew over Lucy's features, and in that glimpse he thought she looked stricken. He waited to hear more, but she merely held her shoulders still and then released a breath. They continued to watch the dance together, although it now seemed to him that her black dress was too cautious and her affection pitiful. Yet he considered her worth pursuing. This might be the time, for they would not be in class together for much longer. Also, he was feeling lonely. But Lucy was his friend. Somehow, despite her ties to the acolytes, she had reserved the right to enjoy the company of their arch-enemy himself, as well as that of the misfit Bernard. She was a gifted poet, she was intelligent and discerning, yet his pleasure in the friendship was possibly too valuable to risk its inevitable ruination. He let the moment pass. Now Miranda was dancing the jitterbug with Bernard, her movements very straight and light, absolutely carefree, somehow much more free and youthful than any of them who were burdened by hopes and expectations. At first Bernard was serious, concentrating on his steps, but as he began to loosen up and make mistakes, which Miranda seemed to love, the two of them became even more fun to watch. The other couples on the floor moved aside. "One more," cried Bernard, whose traitorous blush now went all the way into his shirt collar. Soon after they began again, he tipped Miranda back into an irretrievable position near a bowl of punch. Her gasping throat and shoulders glittered in the rented strobe light. Roman saw Lucy glance at him. He turned to the bar again to hide the desire that must have shown in his face. Later, he drove slowly in an effort to control his drunkenness. It was a crisp winter night. The streets were covered with snow, and there was a stillness in the air that foretold more. Everyone knew where Miranda lived, in the same way everyone knew that she was married, had been married since she was 24, first to Dane Bonham, a man 15 years older than she and an influential literary critic at Berkeley, and now to a Baltimore architect named Michael Howe. She saw Michael 2 weekends a month, and they spent their summers in London. Miranda was 46. There were no children. The house stood on the edge of a good neighborhood, near a maze of smaller streets where he could park his car and wander unnoticed into the alley behind. It was a spacious Victorian with a porch that wrapped around two sides, far too large for a childless commuting couple. The outside was painted beige with dark red and green trim that in the night looked black. Half-covered rabbit tracks crisscrossed the yard. The barren spines that remained in her untidy gardens were bent with snow. Roman made an effort to walk carefully, but he stumbled after unlatching the gate. A bit of snow fell into his eyes as he slipped under the trellis. He stopped to wipe his face. For a moment, as he stood sniffing the winter air, the mixture of burning firewood and cold, which had spoken to him since childhood of other people's easy lives. Even at the night, in the dark, Miranda's house said careless safety. It said comfort. High in an upstairs corner of the house, a dim light shone. Roman stepped onto the back porch. "Miranda!" he shouted. There was no answer. "Miranda! Miranda!" His baritone, in which he took some pride, ricocheted off the porch and toward her window. There was no response. Still, she did not turn out the light. He began to sing. An owl and a pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea-green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money, wrapped up in a 5-pound note. He imagined her upstairs with the book, frowning at the text as if by fervent reading she could will him gone. "Oh, lovely pussy, oh, lovely pussy, what a beautiful pussy you are. You are, you are, what a beautiful pussy you are." Still, there was no response. "Miranda," he shouted, "come down or I will next recite a series of my poems." The wind picked up as if the house itself had sighed in irritation. After a long pause, he heard footsteps on the stairs. The door opened and she peered out. "Roman," she said. She wore a white robe that was too large for her. He felt torn between excitement and resentment that she had such confidence and so little fear of him that she had come downstairs, and he looked coldly at the rough tie around her waist and at her breasts half visible in the deep V. "Roman," she said, "you're drunk." "I am." "What do you want?" "I need help," he told her, "with my poems." She reached for her robe and pulled it more closely around her body. When she spoke, her tone was stern. "My office hours are on Wednesdays. You haven't come to office hours all semester." "I'm not one of your sniveling acolytes, you mean." "Spare me the petty social politics of your sex life." He had not expected that she would notice any of that. "I'm your student," he said stiffly. "I'm entitled to your attention." For a long moment, she scrutinized his face. "You haven't come to office hours all semester," she repeated. Then she peered down at her slippers. Watching her intently now, Roman focused on the dark fringes of her eyelashes. She went on speaking slowly, almost to herself. "You sit in class," she said, "glowering at everyone who speaks and saying almost nothing. You don't show us a single poem for 14 weeks. Then, in week 15, after the last class, you show up stone drunk at my door at 2:30 a.m. and say that you want help?" "Need help," he corrected her. She said in a lower voice, "Need help." Roman moved closer to her, to her house. "You don't like my poems," he said. "I know you don't. But I do have a soul, and you know that too. No one, not even you, has the privilege to say what you did." When she did not reply, he knew that he had spoken the truth. He had nothing more to do but wait for her to make up her mind. She stood silently on the threshold with a bar of pale light across her throat and shoulders. Then she opened wide the door and led him into the house. Thanks.